Operation Barbarossa was launched early on 22 June 1941, just a few weeks after the German invasion of Crete, and was the largest clash of arms the world had ever seen. Germany had amassed more than 3 million men, a colossal number, yet in truth Adolf Hitler's forces were not fully prepared for a campaign on this scale. History would later prove that this may have been Germany's first gross mistake, eventually leading to their defeat in World War II. Less than 4 years later, the mighty Third Reich collapsed onto itself in just a few months, but the beginnings of this process can be traced to the Germans' costly losses in the Soviet Union. Hitler had originally intended to invade the Soviet Union only after France and Britain had been defeated and Europe subjugated. As a veteran of the defeat of the First World War, he understood the danger of fighting on two fronts and overstretching Germany's meager resources. Yet Britain had not been defeated, and hovering in the background was the United States, with its huge economic potential and open hostility to Nazi Germany. Already Germany was running short of vital supplies, but especially food and oil, and plundering the Soviet Union now seemed the best chance of making up these shortfalls. Hitler, however, was confident of success. After all, Germany had recently defeated the powerful France in 6 weeks, while the Red Army had been having trouble in Finland during the so-called Winter War of 1939–40. To Hitler, this indicated that the Third Reich was unstoppable, while Stalin's troops were just expendable men without experience or determination to win battles. The trouble was, the Soviet Union was more than 10 times the size of France and the Low Countries, and Germany had a force that was only slightly larger than that of the previous year when Hitler attacked in the West. What's more, he had only 30% more panzer forces, the German elite units that had been the spearhead of victory in France. As in France, most German troops were to advance into Russia on foot and by horse. The difference was that the attack front for Barbarossa was more than 1,200 miles long. The General Staff of the German Army had already put together a plan to take the farmlands of the Ukraine. This would mean starving the astounding figure of 20 or 30 million Soviet citizens, but Nazi Germany viewed it as a war of survival, so this was considered acceptable. The Soviet leadership and intellectuals would also need to be exterminated. Hitler told his generals they had 3 months to win this victory, after which they would then turn back west and deal with Britain once and for all. In the first days and weeks of the invasion, all seemed to go spectacularly well, helped by the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's refusal to accept any warning sign of an imminent attack. Historians proved that he had accurate reports of a massive German buildup along the border in former Poland, but for some reason, perhaps because Germany had signed a secret pact of non-aggression only 2 years before, he did nothing to stop the German invasion. Overwhelming force along what was initially a 500-mile front managed to secure huge chunks of Soviet territory in the first fortnight of battle as the German armies swept forward, while above, the Luftwaffe hammered the Red Army's air forces. The Baltic states were swiftly overrun in the north, while in the center much of former Poland was swept aside. Once again, the German armies seemed unstoppable. What happened in only 3 years that would completely overturn this situation, so that the Soviets absolutely obliterated the invading Germans and started to push them back, eventually reaching Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich itself? The Russians had a word for this. They called it Bagration. 1944, a key year and Hitler's greatest challenge. So far, early 1943 saw the end of the cruel siege of Stalingrad, where up to 1.2 million people lost their lives. From that moment on, the balance of forces started to change. Another important turning point was the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored clash in history and a victory of enormous importance for the Soviet forces. After Stalingrad and Kursk, Stalin realized that he now needed to play offensive for the first time since the start of Operation Barbarossa. After Kursk, the Red Army continued to drive the Germans west into the Ukraine, using 5 army groups simultaneously. This autumn offensive became collectively known as the Battle of the Dnepr, the river that ran through this part of the Soviet Union. General Rokossovsky's Central Front led the way, reaching the Dnepr north of Kiev in September, and closely followed to the south by the Voronezh Front. Bitter fighting followed, and Kiev was not retaken until 6 November, but it meant the old capital of the Ukraine was now back in Soviet hands, and with it a huge bridgehead 200 miles wide and 90 deep. By the end of December, the entire front had shifted hundreds of miles westwards. The Crimea had been isolated, the Dnieper crossed, and the Central Front had created a vast bridgehead that extended as far as the city of Korostin near Pripyat. The Red Army triumphed to the north as well. By January 1944, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts had amassed just under 1 million men and nearly 22,000 guns, while lying offshore was the Baltic Fleet. The Red Army attack began on 14th January and soon pushed the Germans back. The last German shell to land on Leningrad fell on 23rd January. 4 days later, at 8 o'clock in the evening, the sky over the city lit up with a mass of color as more than 300 guns fired a salute of triumph. After 880 days, the terrible siege of Leningrad was finally over. With these important victories, Stalin was getting closer to exacting revenge upon the treacherous and vicious Germans. 1943 had been the year Russians fought for their own land. 1944 would be the year when they took the battleground to the territories known as Prussia. By 1944, the German soldiers found themselves in a vulnerable and fluid situation. With a lack of proper armoured fire support, additional men and weaponry, soldiers were compelled to dig in and defend positions, often with only an array of machine guns and anti-tank guns. As a result of the lack of supplies, a sense of futility and gloom gripped the German soldier. On the Central Front, countless thousands of soldiers had been killed since the summer of 1943, and almost a year later, the Germans found themselves pushed back, holding parts of a front almost reminiscent of World War I, with a string of defensive positions, trenches and shell holes, in which gains and losses could be measured only in yards. Just another incentive for Stalin to push forward, to strike while the iron was hot, that is, before Hitler could gather more forces to send to the Eastern Front. The problem for Hitler was, he already had his plate full in the west, after the Allies landed in Normandy north of France on June 6, 1944, a date that would go into history as D-Day. The Normandy landings were the largest seaborne invasion in history, with nearly 5,000 landing and assault craft, 289 escort vessels, and 277 minesweepers participating. During D-Day, nearly 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel. This number increased the following days, with 875,000 men disembarking by the end of June. Allied casualties were, just on that first day, at least 10,000, with 4,414 confirmed dead. It is calculated that the Germans sustained between 5,000 and 9,000 casualties, either killed, wounded, missing or captured. France was liberated in just 2 months, and the rapid advance of the Allies in the western border of the Third Reich seemed to preoccupy Hitler much more than the Russian advance in the east, which he thought was under control thanks to the powerful army group center. In fact, it was probably this overconfidence that ended up being Hitler's doom. But he had reasons to be confident. Hitler's bold gambles from 1938 to 1941 had resulted in a string of remarkable German military victories. Much of the German military leadership had been skeptical of Hitler's plans, and these early victories convinced Hitler of his genius for war, as well as creating in him a visceral disdain for the judgments of the senior German military leadership. Hitler became convinced that any victory was due to his brilliance and any defeat to the incompetence of the generals. He removed officers who questioned his judgments and gradually became surrounded by sycophants who would support his increasingly deluded view of the strategic situation. Hitler was a skilled amateur at military planning. His military vision had been shaped by his distinguished service as a young infantryman in World War I. Like many Germans of his generation, he was convinced that Germany could have won that war if only it had had the will to resist. He saw himself as the embodiment of that will and acted ruthlessly against any German commander who did not show a similar enthusiasm for resistance to the death. Hitler's strategic judgment of the Soviet Union in 1944 was that it was teetering on the edge of collapse, and would collapse as it had in 1917 if Germany simply held on long enough. Hitler was simply unwilling to believe that Soviet military strength was increasing rather than weakening, since this would have undermined his confidence in the ultimate victory of Germany. As evidence continued to mount of Germany's growing weakness in the face of the two-front onslaught, Hitler continued to retreat into a world of unreality. pinning his hopes on wonder weapons and enemy blunders. As Germany was forced onto the strategic defensive in 1944, Hitler adamantly refused to give up an inch of territory, even when a tactical retreat would have placed German troops in better defensive positions. For Hitler, tactical retreats were signs of defeatism and a lack of will to overcome the Soviets. It was symptomatic of this outlook that his 1944 instructions to German commanders on the Eastern Front were to prepare major cities as strongpoints or centers of resistance if the Soviets did break through the German defenses, and their garrisons were expected to fight to the last man. Retreat was never an option. The immediate effect of this outlook was Hitler's insistence on personal authorization of tactical retreats, even minor ones. The German army in general, and Army Group Center in particular, lost its tactical flexibility, which made it more vulnerable to the Red Army. The German Army Group Center and the Soviet offensive in Belarus. In 1944, the German army experienced increasingly heavy losses in the east, losing most of the captured Ukraine in the process. The price they paid for angering the Russians was heavy, with thousands of wounded men being left behind. Divisions that had fought with iron determination against the Soviets were badly mauled, and the Red Army ruthlessly exploited the resulting weakness when the spring campaigns began. More encirclements and breakouts followed, each one resulting in a further hemorrhage of German strength. But the main blow fell further north, against the German Army Group Center. Careful deceptive measures ensured that the Germans were unaware of the magnitude of the forces assembling against them, though there was awareness that a major attack was coming. On 22nd June 1944, nearly 1.7 million men of the Red Army, backed by more than 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns and supported by 24,000 artillery pieces and heavy mortars, launched Operation Bagration. This offensive, every bit as murderously efficient as any German campaign in the war, simply overwhelmed and obliterated Army Group Center. By 4th July, the Army Group had effectively ceased to exist. A 400-kilometer gap in the German front had been ripped open, and 350,000 German soldiers from generals to privates were dead, captured or missing. The magnitude of this defeat dwarfed even the losses at Stalingrad, as the Soviet tank armies immediately went on to exploit their success, opposed only by whatever scratch forces and transferred units the Germans could throw into the immense hole in their lines. By late July, the Red Army had advanced from Vitebsk to the Vistula and stood in the suburbs of Warsaw. The German forces of Army Group Center were not prepared to face the coming onslaught from the Red Army. Due to a serious misunderstanding of Soviet intentions, the Germans did not expect Army Group Center to face the main Soviet thrust. The heavy drain of panzer units to France and northern Ukraine had left Army Group Center with a primarily infantry force, very weakly supported in both armor and aircraft. The situation was made even worse on the 30th of May 1944, when Model managed to convince Hitler to shift the 56th Panzer Corps from Army Group Center to Army Group North Ukraine. On the eve of Operation Bagration, Army Group Center had 34 infantry divisions, 2 Luftwaffe field divisions, 7 security divisions, 2 Panzer Grenadier divisions, and 1 Panzer division. There were several Hungarian divisions to the rear, but the Germans placed little hope in these formations. In total, the German armed forces in Belarus had the equivalent of 52 divisions, with about 400,000 combat troops and a further 400,000 in support units, administrative posts, and other non-combat positions. While this was a very substantial force, the terrain they needed to cover was enormous. Given the length of the front to be defended, German infantry divisions were stretched beyond prudent limits. Each division covered a front of around 30 kilometers, which was almost double the norm. This meant that each kilometer of front was covered by only about 80 frontline infantry, backed up on average by 2 or 3 artillery pieces and 1 or 2 assault guns. The low density of German forces along the front line also forced Army Group Center planners to keep a minimal strategic reserve. Virtually all of the divisions held a sector of the front, so once the Soviets penetrated the frontline infantry formations, there was little or no defense in depth. The Germans did partially fortify a number of major towns and cities, but these locations were weakly held by support troops. The quality of German infantry troops had declined steadily through the war due to the enormous casualties. Since 1943, there had been a steady influx of Alsatians, Poles, and other ethnic minorities from the fringes of the country, few of whom had enthusiasm for dying for Hitler's Germany. Although German panzer units did not suffer these problems, increasing shortages of fuel had led to severe curtailments in training, which had a detrimental effect on their combat performance. The clear tactical advantage enjoyed by German troops early in the Russo-German War was disappearing, as German troop quality became increasingly mediocre and Soviet troop performance improved. Army Group Center fought from prepared defensive positions. The Belarus sector had been relatively static for several months before Operation Bagration, which meant that the Germans had been able to carry out extensive field fortification work. In general, each division constructed 3 to 5 trench lines to a depth of 5 to 6 kilometers. These defensive positions included reinforced machine gun and mortar pits, but there were generally few concrete field fortifications. The defensive belts were very heavily mined, and most were protected by extensive barbed wire barriers and some anti-tank barriers. By this stage of the war, the infantry was well provided with Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket, and this was often supplemented by the division's few-towed 88mm anti-aircraft guns. On the other side, the Red Army units involved in Operation Bagration were a formidable force. The 4 Red Army fronts totaled 118 rifle divisions, 8 tank and mechanized corps, 6 cavalry divisions, 13 artillery divisions, and 14 air defense divisions. These units possessed about 1,700,000 troops and support personnel, that is, more than double their German opponents. Soviet rifle divisions were generally smaller than their German counterparts, averaging 3,000 troops. At the time of Operation Bagration, a concerted effort was made to bring these units up to an average of 6,000 troops. By 1944, a Soviet rifle corps was similar to a British or American infantry division in firepower. Likewise, a Soviet tank corps was similar in size to an American armored division. The 6 cavalry divisions were intended to provide the Red Army with mobility in the poor terrain, like forests and marshes that were not suitable for armored vehicles. Cavalry was derided in Western Europe as a worthless anachronism, but on the Eastern Front it was still quite useful. The Red Army enjoyed substantial numerical advantages in armored equipment. During the initial phase of Operation Bagration, there were 2,715 tanks and 1,355 assault guns, roughly a 6-fold advantage over the Germans. About 40% of the Soviet armor was allotted to tank and assault gun units attached to the rifle corps to provide direct fire support during the penetration phase of the operation. A little over 60% of the armor was contained in the tank, mechanized and cavalry units that would conduct the exploitation phase of the operation once the rifle corps had penetrated the German defensive belt. Most of the Soviet tanks were medium tanks. The most common type was the T-34 Model 1943, armed with a 76mm gun. The new T-34-85 tank had entered service earlier in 1944 and was available in some quantity, often as much as a third of the medium tank brigades. Some Soviet units were equipped with lent American M4A2 Sherman tanks. The Red Army had another significant advantage: the presence of a large partisan movement behind German lines. Belarus was the site of the largest and most vigorous partisan movement in the Soviet Union, actively supported since 1942 by extensive airdrops of equipment and personnel. At the beginning of 1943, partisan strength in Belarus had been about 150,000. By June 1944, it had risen to 270,000, organized into 157 brigades and 83 smaller detachments. This tied down a substantial number of German troops. Russian sources claim that the Belarusian partisan movement destroyed 11,128 railway cars, 34 armored trains, 18,700 vehicles, 1,355 armored vehicles, and 500,000 enemy personnel during the war. Operation Bagration, a Soviet D-Day. The formal start of Operation Bagration was scheduled for 5 a.m. on 23rd of June 1944 and began with heavy artillery preparation all along the front. On average, each artillery piece was allotted 2 units of fire for the mission. This meant 160 rounds for a 122mm howitzer, that is, about 6 tons of ammunition. The barrages were brutal, lasting over 2 hours on average. Most began with a 10 to 20-minute period of intense shelling against the initial German trench lines to a depth of 6 kilometers. This was intended to crush the forward trenches and destroy the German infantry before they could withdraw to deeper defense lines. Each artillery piece fired at an increasing rate, so that by the last 5 minutes of the initial barrage, each weapon was being fired at the technical limit of its endurance. In some sectors, this was followed by a rolling barrage directed against the forward trench lines for up to an hour. In other sectors, where the German defenses were especially dense, a double rolling barrage was conducted. This tactic consisted of assigning the artillery to 2 groups. The first conducted a rolling barrage successively against the main and intermediate defense lines. The second concentrated only on the main defense line, beginning with the second trench line. This was the first time a double rolling barrage had been used on the Eastern Front, and it was made possible by the density of Soviet artillery in Bagration. 3 multiple rocket launcher divisions and many smaller units also took part in the preparation. Their targets largely overlapped the conventional artillery targets and helped saturate the objectives. German artillery began a meek counter-battery riposte, only to be engaged by special long-range artillery formations. German accounts of the artillery preparation uniformly describe it as being of an intensity and destructiveness never before seen during the war. The artillery preparation was followed by the first infantry attacks. The Red Army employed concentrated groups of infantry, supported by highly concentrated and well-controlled fire from heavy weapons. This combination proved to be lethal for the poorly prepared German defenses. By the afternoon, the 3rd Panzer Army was suffering substantial inroads into its defenses. The most important Soviet objective at this time was the main Moscow-Minsk highway from Smolensk to Orsha. This area had been bitterly contested in the previous fighting in the autumn and winter of 1943 to 44, and the Germans had heavily fortified and mined it. As a result, the Soviet 11th Guards Army attacking towards Orsha used special assault groups. These were composed of engineer and tank units specially configured to breach the densest defensive belts. They attacked with 5 rifle divisions. The 3 southernmost divisions attacking the fortified belt were preceded by an armored assault force. Each of the 3 assault forces consisted of a company of 10 T-34 tanks fitted with mine rollers, followed behind by a heavy tank regiment with 21 Russian IS-2 or KV tanks. Behind all this armor and firepower came the initial wave of the rifle regiments, supported by a flamethrower tank company and a light assault gun regiment. This impressive force did not advance fast. Not only was there a problem with mines and tank traps, but tenacious German infantry lurked in artillery shell holes with Panzerfaust rocket grenades. By the end of the first day of full-scale fighting, the offensive was progressing well. The city of Vitebsk was on the verge of being surrounded, and the main road to Minsk appeared to be within grasp of the 11th Guards Army. The Germans still did not believe that this was the main Soviet effort, so no real attempt was made to redirect strategic reserves into the area. By the morning of 24th July, it was evident to the 3rd Panzer Army commander, General Georg Hans Reinhardt, that the Red Army was attempting to cut off the city of Vitebsk, so it became his priority to defend it. By late morning, 2 Soviet armies were rapidly converging behind Vitebsk to the west. The whole German 53rd Corps was about to be trapped. The German authorities in the field decided that their only chance was to prepare a breakout operation. This is, to try and break the Soviet encirclement in order to build a path where surrounded troops could escape. General Reinhardt requested authority for independent action. This was refused by Hitler, who was against any type of retreat. Field Marshal Ernst Busch had no choice but to order the infantry divisions to remain in place to defend the city. It was a matter of time before the Soviets captured Vitebsk, making every German soldier a prisoner. With the rupture of the German defensive perimeter around Vitebsk complete, both Soviet fronts began efforts to link up and commence the exploitation phase. By the early afternoon of 24th July, the 1st Baltic Front's 1st Tank Corps was on the move to the southwest, and its reconnaissance units had already reached the Dvina River and secured a partially damaged bridge. By the morning of 25th June, the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division was surrounded at Ostrovno of the 9th Corps along the front line, and in some places along the 2nd defense belt called the Tiger Line. At 2:45 a.m., the 9th Corps was ordered to conduct a fighting withdrawal from the Tiger Line to a secondary line west of the Dvina River. By noon, the lead elements of the Red Army were already on the east bank of Dvina in hot pursuit, and several bridges had to be blown, even though there were still German forces east of the river. With the German tactical defenses overcome that evening, Soviet General Ivan Chernyakhovsky ordered his troops to begin an exploitation mission. These operations left the German 53rd Corps in Vitebsk completely cut off and vulnerable to the Soviet army. By the morning of 25th of June, the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division was surrounded at Ostrovno. The Soviet 39th Army overwhelmed the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division that evening and threatened to do the same to the 246th Infantry Division and the 6th Luftwaffe Field Division. Field Marshal Busch attempted to persuade Hitler to permit at least one of his corps to pull back from Vitebsk and assist the breakout attempt, but Hitler reminded him that his orders were clear: fight or die trying. Two German divisions became isolated 10 kilometers southwest of Vitebsk, with parts of an infantry division trapped inside the city, while the Soviets were methodically reducing the defenses with airstrikes and repeated infantry attacks. By the evening of 26th of June, the positions of the Vitebsk garrison had become hopeless, as the Soviet 39th Army penetrated the German defenses at several points. Tens of thousands of German troops were captured by the Soviets that evening and the following days, and arrangements were made for them to be transported to prisoner-of-war camps near the front line. The 1944 Parade of the Vanquished: How to Humiliate the Germans. The destruction of Army Group Center was the greatest single defeat of the German army in World War II. In less than 2 weeks, the Red Army destroyed more divisions and troops than at Stalingrad 16 months earlier. The sudden vacuum created by the massive losses of men and material forced the Germans to shift divisions from both Army Group North and Army Group North Ukraine as the Red Army prepared to launch offensive operations in these theaters. The total extent of German losses from Operation Bagration will never be accurately known. Germany lost the equivalent of 25 to 30 divisions. 17 divisions were completely destroyed. Manpower losses at a minimum were 300,000 troops, and probably closer to 350,000. Of those, about 150,000 were captured, of which about half were killed on their way to prisoner-of-war camps or died from malnutrition or disease in the camps. But perhaps the most accurate depiction of the extent of Germany's defeat in the Eastern Front was a surprising event that happened in the Soviet capital. While most German prisoners of war were used for forceful labor in different parts of the country, Stalin had different plans for at least one-third of them. A convoy of trains carrying 57,000 German prisoners set out from the Eastern Front towards the capital of the Soviet Union on July 17, 1944, at 11 a.m. The operation was carried out in secrecy. Neither the military who escorted the prisoners of war to Moscow, nor the prisoners themselves or the residents of Moscow had any clue about the parade that was being planned by the Communist Party higher-ups. Starting on July 14th, German prisoners began arriving in Moscow. They were accommodated at the Dynamo Stadium and the Moscow Hippodrome. 18 trainloads of prisoners were to be marched from the Hippodrome along Leningrad Avenue and Tverskaya Street via Mayakovsky Square to the Garden Ring, and then along the ring until the Kursk railway station. The remaining 8 trainloads of Germans were supposed to march the other way from Mayakovsky Square along the Garden Ring until Kaluzhskaya Square and then southeast down Lenin Avenue until Kanachikovo railway station. Commander of the Moscow Military District, Colonel General Pavel Artemyev, was in charge of the convoys. The public order, public safety and transport security were to be maintained by military commandant of Moscow Major General Kuzma Sinilov and Moscow Police Chief Commissar Second Rank Viktor Romanchenko. The announcement to the public was made by the Moscow police chief on the back page of the Pravda daily on the same day of the march. It was a surprise to everyone. The public was informed that on July 17, 1944, a convoy of 57,600 German prisoners of war would be marching through the center of Moscow on its way to the prisoner of war camps. The exact details of the routes were given so that everyone could see the parade where they found most convenient. The residents and visitors to Moscow were also informed that traffic and accessibility of the streets along the routes would be restricted. All Soviet citizens were advised to comply with the order maintained by the police force and not to disturb the prisoners in any way. German prisoners left the Moscow Hippodrome in large formations of 600 men, 20 per row at 11 a.m., just as planned. They were well fed and given water to make sure they could withstand the long march. They marched on foot in silence and without any of their banners or flags. All the prisoners had their arms and legs free, but they knew that trying to escape would be pointless. A total of 1,227 highest-ranking captured officers were in charge of leading the parade. At the head of the march were 19 generals and 6 colonels in full uniform, bedecked with medals, and 6 colonels and lieutenant colonels. Among the generals were Commander of the 27th Army Corps General of the Infantry, Paul Gustav Volkers, Commander of the 53rd Army Corps General of the Infantry, Friedrich Gollwitzer, Commander of the 12th Army Corps, Lieutenant General Vinzenz Müller, Commandant of Mogilev, Major General Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf, and Military Commander of Bobruisk, Lieutenant General Adolf Hamann. Erdmannsdorf and Hamann were later publicly executed for war crimes. Vinzenz Müller became a convinced anti-Nazi and returned to a military career in the German Democratic Republic and even became a member of the East German Parliament. His life ended in 1961 under dubious circumstances when he fell from a balcony at his home. General Volkers died in Soviet captivity, although the exact details are unknown. Friedrich Gollwitzer was convicted as a war criminal in the Soviet Union and released in 1955. The so-called Parade of the Vanquished was contemplated by the Moscow crowd in silence. A few curses were aimed at the passing Germans, while any attempt to throw stones was immediately stopped. The public was puzzled. This was not the kind of parade they were used to seeing. In total, more than 120,000 people gathered along the parade route to watch the German prisoners march toward the train stations that would take them to the forced labor camps. Hitler had promised the troops that one day they would be marching through the main avenues of Moscow, but this was not how they pictured it. The parade ended with a cleanup. Sprinkler trucks drove down the streets where the German soldiers had marched, symbolically rinsing Moscow of the dirt. A few hours after the parade, everything went back to normal, while the war still raged in the West. But for the Russian people, this parade had a very strong message. There was hope now. The end of the war was drawing near, and the families would soon be able to reunite with those that had been serving the country in the battlefield. For the survivors of Army Group Center, however, it was a completely different story. Most of them did not return to Germany until the mid-1950s, after nearly a decade in Stalin's gulag mining minerals and chopping wood. Soviet casualties from Operation Bagration had also been high. The heaviest losses had been suffered by the First Belarusian Front, with some 65,779 men lost. The total casualties of all 4 fronts was 178,507 troops. Bagration had been a complete success, but it came with a price. Within the first 3 weeks of Operation Bagration, the Soviet forces had already captured 22 German generals. On July 17, 1944, 19 of them were paraded through the streets of Moscow alongside 57,000 German prisoners in an event known as the March of the Lost. Although the offensive would continue until late August, German losses in just those first weeks, killed, wounded, and captured, had already surpassed the devastation they suffered at Stalingrad. The central sector of the German front collapsed, retreating over 300 kilometers and leaving a massive gap in the lines. With Minsk encircled and no immediate German counterattack in sight, Soviet commanders seized the opportunity to push toward East Prussia. In desperation, the German High Command began pulling divisions from both the northern and southern flanks, unintentionally weakening other sectors of the front. This was precisely the moment the Soviets had anticipated. They launched two additional offensives, one driving toward the Baltic Sea and another pushing westward through Poland from Ukraine. The Red Army reached the outskirts of Warsaw and secured much of western Ukraine. It was only the severe strain on their supply lines that eventually brought a pause to what had been a stunningly rapid and far-reaching campaign, one that had exceeded even their own expectations. Celebrating the fall of Nazi Germany. The Victory Parade of 1945. The Parade of the Vanquished was not just a propaganda stunt. The war would really end, at least in Europe, less than a year later. Nazi Germany surrendered on 9th May 1945. 6 weeks following the fall of Berlin and the end of the Great Patriotic War, a massive military parade was organized for residents of the Soviet capital city. It would prove to be a very different parade from the previous one, a celebration of victory instead of a humiliation to the defeated. People were encouraged this time to chant and be happy, and to cheer for the marching troops. Organized and undertaken on the direct orders of Stalin himself, the 1945 Victory Parade was, and still is, the largest ever held on Moscow's Red Square. 40,000 soldiers, sailors, and other service personnel, accompanied by 1,850 tanks, artillery pieces, and assorted equipment were mobilized for the occasion, despite of the heavy rain that was present that day. In charge of the parade was the commander of the 2nd Belarusian Front, Marshal of the Soviet Union and hero of Operation Bagration, K.K. Rokossovsky. On June 22, 1945, the major Soviet newspapers published the words of Joseph Stalin calling upon a so-called Victory Parade for June 24, 1945 in Moscow's Red Square. Intensive preparations had been in place since late May, and a rehearsal for infantry units was held in early June on Moscow's Garden Ring from the Crimean Bridge to the Smolensk Place. Artillery units were carefully inspected, as well as mechanized and armored vehicles. Several formed and trained regiments would march, representing each front, which was in force at the end of the war and led by commanders of the fronts. It was decided to bring from Berlin the red flag that had been hoisted over the Reichstag on May 2nd. The organizers let each regiment choose their favorite military marches. The penultimate rehearsal for Victory Day Parade was held at the Central Airfield and the General One in Red Square. Everything needed to be perfectly planned and executed. On June 22nd at 10 a.m., marshals of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky, appeared on Red Square on a white horse and a black horse. The square was immediately swept with a roar of applause. Then, the combined military orchestra of 1,400 musicians played the hymn called Glory to the Russian People. After that, the commander of the parade, Rokossovsky, reported on the readiness for the start of the parade. The marshals made a detour of troops and paid respects to the Lenin Mausoleum located in the Red Square. Then Zhukov got up to the podium and, on behalf of the Soviet government and Communist Party, congratulated the brave Soviet soldiers and all the people over the great victory over Nazi Germany. At that moment, the anthem of the Soviet Union was played, and a solemn march of the troops began. The Victory Parade was attended by the regiments of the fronts, of the People's Commissariat of Defense and the Navy, military academies, colleges, and units of the Moscow garrison. Combined regiments included the rank and file, sergeants and officers of different arms, who had distinguished themselves in battle and had been awarded with military orders. Following the regiments of the fronts and the Navy, one of the most celebrated moments of the parade happened. A column of Soviet soldiers carrying 200 banners taken from defeated Nazi troops entered the Red Square and dropped them to the ground to the foot of the mausoleum, as a sign of the crushing defeat of the aggressor. At 11 p.m., the sky over Moscow lit up with searchlights, hundreds of balloons were released, and from the ground were heard the volleys of fireworks. The next day, June 25th, the Grand Kremlin Palace hosted a reception in honor of the Victory Day parade. After a grand celebration in Moscow, upon the suggestion of the Soviet government and the Supreme Command, in September 1945 there was held a small parade of Allied troops in Berlin, which was attended by Soviet, American, British and French troops. In total, 40,000 Red Army soldiers marched on the Victory Parade, and 1,850 military vehicles participated. Thousands of guests and probably over 1 million people gathered to watch and take part of the celebrations, despite the rain. After so many years of war and much of it fought in their own ground, it was a deserved moment of happiness for the Soviet people.